Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's gathering hosted by the Chinese American Civic Association, or CACA, a nonprofit organization based in Bellevue since July 2019. My name is Victor, a volunteer at CACA, and I'm pleased to host today's presentation. CACA is committed to serving the local Chinese community and promoting its influence in various aspects while taking pride in its diverse range of programs, which include the Youth Leadership Enhancement Program, among others. This program serves as a platform for young Chinese Americans to develop their leadership skills and make a positive impact. As we celebrate Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, we are thrilled to expand our efforts beyond the Chinese community and collaborate with school districts and local government agencies in Western Washington State. Through our partnership with the Bellevue School Districts, we have organized a wide range of engaging activities for students. By engaging in Chinese classical dance, wuzheng, Chinese painting, paper cutting, tai chi, kung fu, lion dance, and dragon dance, students can explore and embrace the rich traditions of our heritage while celebrating cultural diversity. In addition, we have curated exhibits honoring the remarkable contributions of Chinese railroad workers displayed in prominent government agencies and community spaces, including the City of Bellevue, City of Linwood, and the Olympia Center, and Renton Technical College. By showcasing their legacy, we aim to inspire future generations with their resilience and perseverance. Today, as part of our Asian Pacific American Heritage Month activities, we are privileged to have distinguished guest speakers, James Chiao and Phillip Chiao, who will be talking about the Chinese and salmon canning industry in the Chinese exclusion era. We thank you for joining us in the celebration of heritage, diversity, and unity. Let's embark on this enlightening journey together, embracing the power of knowledge and storytelling. First off, James and Phillips are twins. James Chiao is an electrical engineer by profession. He received his Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering from the University of Washington and a Master of Science in Electrical Engineering from Case Western Reserve University. He retired from engineering in 2015. He is co-founder and currently co-chairman of a nonprofit organization, Friends of Children with Special Needs, and an advisory board member of Chinese Historical and Cultural Project. He and his wife are residents of Fremont, California. Philip C. Chiao is an architect by profession. He has his Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from the University of Washington and a Master of Architecture degree from the University of Illinois. He retired from his profession in 2016. He is currently a member of the Design Review Committee for the City of Pasadena. He and his wife are also residents of Pasadena. Since retirement, the Chiao brothers have devoted their spare time to the promotion of the history of the Chinese Americans in the salmon canning industry. They have a website that carries stories of Chinese workers and contractors and other related topics. They published their first book, The Price of Salmon, by Max Stern in summer of 2022. Thank you and enjoy the lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us. As the UW graduates, we are really glad to be here and to talk to you about the history of Chinese and salmon canning industry. Let me share my screen with you. Okay, here's this. Share the screen and okay, I think we're ready to go. Okay, let me start by telling you a little bit more about ourselves. I'm Jim, and next to me is my twin brother, Philip. We grew up in Taiwan, but our journey to the United States was a little bit different than the other people. You see, in the 1960s, Taiwan, or the Republic of China, was providing technical assistance to many African nations. My father was a meteorologist. In 1964, he was sent to Libya. In 1965, the rest of our family joined him, and we lived in the city of Benghazi for 3 years. In 1968, we were sent to the United States to further our education. We were 17 years old at the time, and we were among the very few foreign students in our high school.
I think our father was very much aware of the 1965 Immigration Act that for the first time allowed Chinese immigration to America since the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. If the first wave of Chinese immigration happened in the 19th century, now we were among the second wave that happened after 1965. Most of us arrived with a student visa. From 1969 to 1973, we attended the University of Washington in Seattle as undergraduate students. Those two photos here were taken in front of the engineering building on UW campus in 1970.
At the end of our freshman year, we needed summer jobs to pay for ourselves. But Seattle was in a recession in 1970, and Boeing was the #1 employer and had one of its worst layoffs in many years. I remember one painter who came to paint our apartment building was a laid-off Boeing engineer. The employment situation was really bad, as evidenced by this billboard in 1971. It reads, "Will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights?" In summer 1970, we first tried to find work in Chinese restaurants without any success. Later, by chance, we saw an ad for jobs in Alaska salmon canneries. We went to a union building to apply for a cannery job in late spring of 1970. It was located on 2nd Street and South Main Street in downtown Seattle, near Chinatown, as shown in the photo on the left. We were surprised to find out that the union was controlled by the Filipinos, and most of the members were also Filipinos. Look at this photo on the right. None of us looks like a cannery worker. We learned the hard way that the union was run on a compadre system, and that most of the new openings were given to relatives or friends. After 4 or 5 weeks, I think we finally got our job by currying favor with the union boss. I remember the first thing we did was giving him an expensive bottle of liquor that surely caught his attention.
A few days after we were dispatched, we were on our way to Alaska. As shown on the map in the center, our destination was Waterfall on Prince of Wales Island in southeast Alaska, about 1 hour flight from Ketchikan. On the photo to the left, we just arrived Ketchikan from Seattle, where we now switched to a float plan. And the photo on the right, we are approaching Waterfall, and from the air, it looks magical, almost like the Fantasy Island.
These photos are from the Waterfall Cannery in 1970. The work in the cannery was hard. The hours were long, but the scenery was breathtaking. In some ways, it was like a dream vacation. Besides seeing a part of the last frontier, we got free room and board, and the pay was good. Besides, there was no place to spend the money, so it was also a dream job. Oh, sorry, let me continue. Altogether, I worked 3 summers in Alaska. I have been to canneries in Southeast Alaska, Central Alaska, and the Bristol Bay. 7 years ago, after retiring from my engineering work, I had the time to look back into the history of cannery workers in Alaska. I was surprised to find out that the early cannery workers were not Filipinos, but Chinese. I thought we could study this part of the Chinese American history, since everyone is familiar with the Chinese and the Transcontinental Railroad, but very few have heard of the Chinese, the salmon canning industry.
For nearly 70 years, from 1870 to 1930, the Chinese dominated the labor market in the salmon canning industry. But this history also reflects the struggle of the Chinese in the era of Chinese exclusion in America. This anti-Chinese era started in the 1880s and lasted till 1943 with the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act. This was a time when the Chinese were singled out as aliens, unfit to be American citizens. They were discriminated against, brutalized, and mistreated. The racism was deep-rooted in American culture and history. However, the Chinese survived in its most difficult and challenging time.
It may appear that we live in an open and democratic society. We enjoy all the freedoms and take them for granted. The freedom to attend public schools, choose our profession, to purchase a home, to own a business, to travel, to vote, and to be protected by law. All the privileges and the civil rights we enjoy today happened after World War II, and only after long and hard fights by many civil rights groups. After 1965, there was a period of relative peace and prosperity for Chinese Americans. However, today, it is disconcerting that anti-Chinese sentiment is on the rise again, mostly due to tension between US and China.
It is hard to imagine a time when you could lose all the rights and privilege of a citizen, but it happened once. That is one reason why we have to look into the Chinese-American history. Today, we will tell the story of the Chinese in the salmon canning industry in the Chinese exclusion era.
In the 1880s, if you were to visit a salmon cannery on the Columbia River, you'll be surprised to find that the workers in the cannery were all Chinese. This was not just one or two canneries, but most of the canneries from Oregon to Washington, clearly Chinese workers had entered the salmon canning industry in a big way.
But there were two other elements hidden behind this fact. One was the rise of the Chinese contractors. The other was the operation of the Chinese contract system. Those three elements were intertwined. The consequence was that the Chinese took control of the labor market of the salmon canning industry and formed a semi-independent sphere of influence. The Chinese dominance lasted from 1870 to the 1930s, or for 60 to 70 years. Both the length of time and its impact on the industry had never been repeated again in any other American industry. How did the salmon canning industry get started? How did its labor market fall into the hands of the Chinese? What caused the rise and decline of the Chinese dominance in the era of Chinese exclusion? Those are the questions we are going to explore today.
The early industries in American West were mainly based on the extraction of natural resources, such as gold, salmon. The origin of the salmon canning industry is a story of California entrepreneurs who took advantage of harvesting salmon from the rivers. By the 1860s, the gold rush in California was over. In 1864, two white fishermen, brothers William and George Hume from Maine, started fishing in the Sacramento River, but they knew very well that the fresh fish could not be preserved and its market was limited. So they came up with the idea of making canned salmon. It just so happens that their friend Hagu both had the knowledge as a tinsmith and experience of a canning lobster. So they brought him from Maine and formed a company called Hagu, Hume and Company.
Shown in this photo is the monument on the bank of the Sacramento River, commemorating the location of the first salmon cannery on the West Coast in 1864. Let's take a look at the historical backdrop of America in the 1860s. In 1861, President Lincoln took office. In 1865, the Civil War ended. According to the 1860 census, the total population of California was 380,000, of which 35,000 were Chinese, accounting to about 10% of the population. Chinese laborers had come to America since the beginning of the California Gold Rush in 1850. They arrived in San Francisco with great hope, but they soon found out that America was different. They could not communicate or mix with the white people. By 1851, the Chinese had established various self-help groups, including temples, towns, and associations. By 1860s, Chinese were active in many labor markets and trades, including fishermen.
This is a drawing of the first salmon cannery. It was built in 1864 on a barge on Sacramento River by the Hume brothers and Hagu. Their equipment was very crude. The cans were filled with fish, sealed, soldered, and then put inside a large pot for cooking. But they must control the temperature, because in order to prevent the solder from melting. So the amount of salt they add became their trade secret. As you can see, all the doors and the windows were shut to discourage prying eyes. The two brothers lived in a hut and on the shore and run a business on a shoestring budget.
In that same year, 1864, Central Pacific Railroad started the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad in Sacramento. From 1864 to 1869, tens and thousands of Chinese laborers were employed, as shown in the upper right photo. There were also a small number of Chinese merchants fighting for contracts to provide Chinese labor. The Transcontinental Railroad opened up the economical lifeline of America, which led to the rapid development of the country into a powerful nation straddling two oceans.
But in just 3 years, the ecological environment of the Sacramento River had deteriorated, and salmon catch dropped sharply. Hume brothers knew they needed a better fishing ground. Heading north, they found abundant salmon in Columbia River and moved their operation there in 1867. 2 years later, they built a second cannery. Within a few years, all 5 Hume brothers entered a new business and made many great contributions. Their success attracted many more entrepreneurs and setting off another gold rush. At that time, anyone who wanted to be successful in this business, they needed 3 ingredients. Number 1, capital. Number 2, technology. Number 3, Chinese labor. There are very few records left by the early Chinese laborers, but we know exactly who were the first group of Chinese laborers in the salmon canning industry. After Hume brothers opened the second cannery in 1869, they had a problem hiring workers. Fortunately, their Chinese cook, Sam, helped them recruiting 12 workers from Portland. It just happens that in 1870 was the year when the census was taken. So the name, the ages, the savings of the 12 Chinese workers were duly recorded. As you can see, the oldest member, Ah Jiang, 40 years old, has 275 in saving. He could be an early arrivals from the gold rush days. The youngest one at the bottom, Ah Wu, 15 years old. He has no saving and might be a new arrival.
We can ask the question whether the introduction of the Chinese into the salmon canning industry was inevitable or accidental. It has an inevitable element. The main reason was the shortage of white laborers and the highly mobile Chinese workers venturing north from California. There were also some accidental elements for the fact that the Hume brothers already know the Chinese from California, and they had a good impression of the Chinese, and also they received help from the Chinese cook.
As we can see from this chart, the growth of the Chinese laborers was really fast in the salmon canning industry. In just a short 12 years, from 1870 to 1882, the number of Chinese workers reached 5,000. So besides the mining, railroads, and agriculture, the fledgling salmon canning industry was definitely a new opportunity.
This chart also represents the simultaneous rise of the Chinese contractors. They were smart businessmen who spoke English and were able to win contracts with the white bosses of the canning companies. Usually, the bidding was based on the price per case packed. Each contract may include several canneries with 75 to 100 workers per cannery.
This group of photos is the most representative of Chinese contractors in the early 20th century. Let's take a look on the left is Les Sum from San Francisco. He was a long-term Chinese business partner of APA, the largest canning company. In the middle is Chen Ji-hee from Portland. He worked as a railroad contractor. Later, he returned to China and built the second railroad in southern China. On the upper right is Gong Dip, who was a very successful businessman. In the photo, he looks majestic in Qing Dynasty's official attire. On the lower right is Li Mei-jin of Seattle, also known as mayor of Chinatown. These people were merchants and overseas Chinese leaders, and they had considerable influence in the local Chinese affairs.
But as Chinese contractors, what they cared the most was their own profit margin, not the interest of the Chinese workers. The contracts they signed with the salmon canning company stipulated their income and duties. They were legally and financially responsible for hiring, feeding, and supervising the Chinese workers, including Chinese foremen and Chinese cooks. White bosses welcomed this collaboration, which gave them more time to hire white craftsmen, fishermen, and to handle cannery management and to develop new markets and fisheries. This method of indirect hiring was called the Chinese contract system. At the time, the Chinese were limited to two social classes. They are either merchants or workers. In the salmon canning industry, Chinese contractors and laborers become indispensable components of the production chain.
This is the APA's list of contractors from 1892 to 1908. APA stands for Alaska Packers Association. It was the largest canning company at the time from the end of the 19th century to the early 20th century. You may not have heard of APA, but the company later merged to become Carpac, and eventually Del Monte Foods. it can be seen that more than half of the contractors were from San Francisco, as highlighted in yellow. San Francisco, this shows the importance of San Francisco in this business. In addition, Seattle and Portland were also strongholds of Chinese contractors and workers. This situation lasted until World War II, when Seattle took over and became the sole dispatching center for Chinese workers.
The formation of the Chinese contract labor system had caused a division of the labor market, creating two tiers. The upper tier belonged to the white artisans, dock workers, and fishermen. They were directly employed by the fishing companies. They were protected by trade unions, and they had higher salaries and a fairly good living condition. The lower tier belonged to the Chinese, all of them non-workers inside canneries. They were employed by the Chinese contractors, and they were paid cheaply with working and living condition in a rather poor situation. One direct consequence of this division of labor was that the people of color were confined to the lower labor market without any opportunities for advancement. For example, Chinese were no longer allowed to fish, period.
There were two types of work, preparation work, before the season start, making tin cans and wooden boxes. On the left, this print from a wood carving shows the operation of making tin cans. As you can see, there are boxes full of tin sheets on the floor with a workbench in the back. All these steps were done by hand and requires a lot of manual labor. Even in the 1970s, when we worked in Alaska, our first few days were spent making boxes. The picture on the right shows us working in front of the egg house. These wooden boxes were used to pack the fresh fish eggs or salmon rolls, all of which was shipped to Japan. To be honest, my grade point average wasn't that good at the time, but my skill of making boxes was really good. I think I deserve an A for that.
Once the fish arrived at the cannery, they were sorted out into different species. The next step was to clean them. What we see here in the picture is the fish cleaning station. Chinese butchers lined up on both sides, ready for action. There are faucets and drains in the middle of the station, and any waste goes down the drain, which falls directly into the river below. Take a look at the size of the fish. Could the butchers stand up to the challenge? But the Chinese butchers were nimble. They could cut off the heads, tail, and fins, open the belly, and remove the scale, all in 7 or 8 strokes. They work 10 hours a day and process 5 to 6 fishes per minute, or about 2,000 fishes per day.
This job was the hardest and best paid because the butchers control the pace of the production line. The white supervisors give them plenty of leeways. If they took a few fish home, the white manager would not say a word. The photo on the right is the photo of me with the Alaska native Indian taken in 1972. His work was closest to that of the early butchers. He lined up a fish on a conveyor belt before the head cutting machine. I remember we often got together during the coffee breaks, but we never had any conversation because he didn't speak a word of English. He always wore a big smile. We have never met a kindler and gentler butcher.
This image here is a wood carving from the 1880s, a real depiction of the production line at a cannery on the Columbia River at the time. It can be seen that almost all of the steps rely on Chinese handiwork. Starting from the lower left corner, a worker cuts the fish into large pieces with a gang knife. To his right, a worker cuts up the fish into smaller pieces and stuffs them into cans. Then you see a worker weighs the can and make adjustments as necessary. Behind him, one worker puts the lids on cans and another one solders them together. At the top right corner, workers are testing for leaks by dipping the cans into hot water to see if any of them have any bubbles. Leaky cans are quickly removed and repaired. In the upper middle, you can see that the cans are stacked onto wooden dollies and sent into the steam oven for cooking. Afterwards, the cans are cleaned and sent to a warehouse for storage.
Since the opening of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, anti-Chinese movements broke out within a few years, and local government had passed various laws and regulations to restrict the rights of the Chinese. Their main complaints were that the Chinese were taking their jobs, and the Chinese were foreigners who could not be assimilated. Chinese resistance was almost passive. Later, the movement became more and more violent and soon escalated to explosion and arson.
Let me describe what actually happened in a small town in Washington state. In 1885, an anti-Chinese group in Birmingham began harassing Chinese residents, sending representatives into Chinese homes in search of what they claimed as criminal behavior. Attacks on the Chinese increased, and the local Chinese received ultimatum to leave by November 7, 1885. According to local newspaper reports, on that night, after expelling the Chinese, white residents held a grand torchlight parade with fireworks and music to boot. All of the Chinese that left town and sought protection in California and Oregon, but there was one exception, Alpha, a cannery worker. He was very much liked and was protected by the local white residents. He was known as the last Chinaman. Here in the center photo is a picture of Alpha in front of his house. And to the right is a photo of Point Roberts Cannery, where Alpha worked.
More Chinese were expelled in Seattle in 1886. Although many Chinese were deported in Washington state in 1885 and 1886, Chinese workers in the Columbia canneries survived. Why? The main reason is quite simple. Because the canneries could not operate without the Chinese workers, so most of the white owners retained them.
In many states, the anti-Chinese forces formed powerful national political alliances, forcing the federal government to pass the Chinese Exclusion Acts of 1882, 88, and 92. From that point on, the Chinese were not allowed to enjoy legal status of immigrants or residents. They were singled out as aliens, which was the beginning of the alien registration or the green card system. Even if one were to get citizenship later, he would still be treated as a second-class citizen. Chinese faced discrimination and restrictions. Their work, their education, marriage, and residence, in short, their livelihood, were all negatively impacted. This put the Chinese in a most disadvantaged position.
The salmon canning industry started in the late 1860s along the Columbia River. By the 1880s, Columbia River was home to many, many canneries, and Astoria was the major cannery town with more than a dozen canneries. Normally, it had a population of over 1,000, but during the canning season, 1,000 to 2,000 Chinese would flock to Astoria to work in the canneries. The town had its own Chinatown with theaters and gambling halls. This was quite different from the situation of isolated canneries in remote areas in Alaska.
By the 1890s, the fishing grounds and market had shifted to Puget Sound, and Seattle was also the home base of the salmon fishing fleet for many years. In this photo taken around 1900, workers unload salmon from barges at a Seattle cannery wharf south of downtown. On the right is a 1914 photo of Pacific American fisheries in Burlingame, Washington. It was one of the largest canneries in the world.
Here is a full-page report from New York newspaper in 1901. It says, an update on the development of the salmon canning industry on the West Coast. On the map, it can be seen that the distribution of salmon canneries had spread from California to Oregon, Washington, and from the southeast to the west of Alaska. But whether it was the number of canneries or fish production, Alaska has taken the lead. In other words, by 1900, the center of the West Coast salmon canning industry had shifted to Alaska.
But 1870 to 1914 was also the time of the second industrial revolution in America. Due to the increasing shortage of Chinese laborers, the salmon canning industry promoted mechanization. Mechanization relied on technology, which could be measured by the countless number of patents and inventions. In fact, almost every step in the production line could be replaced by a newly invented machine. Those inventions, combined with the high-speed conveyor belt, formed a semi-automatic production line. The 6 photographs here illustrate the state-of-the-art machinery in a salmon cannery in 1899. On the upper left is the fish cutting machine. Next over is the machine for stuffing fish into the cans. On the right is the topping machine. On the lower left is the soldering machine. To its right is the tank for testing cans. Next over is the retort for cooking the cans. We can understand why Chinese laborers generally oppose machines. Machines replace some of their positions and reduce them to secondary or subordinate roles. The speed of the production line was no longer controlled by them, but determined by the machines. We can say that the Chinese workers were passive participants in the second industrial revolution.
In 1900, the only job that wasn't replaceable by a new machine was that of the butcher. This lasted until 1903, when a Canadian named Edmund Smith invented the fish cleaning machine. His design was inspired by the hand movement of the Chinese butcher. The fish cleaning machine could do the job of 20 Chinese butchers. After 1910, it was adopted by the canneries and eventually replaced all the Chinese butchers.
After Edmund Smith invented the fish cleaning machine, he first named it the Iron Chink, and even claimed in his advertisement of his intention to replace the Chinese butchers. But the name Chink was an insult to the Chinese, so it was later changed to Smith's fish cleaning machine.
On the left is a photo of the Smith Company in Seattle in 1907. However, there was a tragic ending to Edmund's story. In 1909, he had achieved some success. His machine was widely accepted and recognized in the industry, and iron chink was exhibited at the Seattle's World Fair at the University of Washington. On this photo, you can see Edmund is the one standing at the right. The day before the opening, he drove his sister to the UW campus. However, on the way there, his car hit a pothole and caught on fire. He pushed his sister out, but it was too late for himself. He died in a hospital the next day.
I am very familiar with this steam cooking machine, or what was called the retort. It looks like a locomotive, and on the ground, you can actually see there are two rails for the dolly. In 1972, my job was to stack trays of finished cans onto a dolly, and then the dolly was pushed into the retort. I remember very clearly that the foreman taught me that my job was of a coolie. Many Chinese foreign students took on different jobs, but very few probably ever worked as coolies. There are many theories about the origin of the term coolie, whether it was the porters at railroad station in India or the Chinese laborers who built the transcontinental railroad. The term coolie became connected with the railroad. Many people thought that the early Chinese laborers were indeed coolies. This is not correct. Chinese workers were contracted workers who first come to America on their own free will.
This photo of the iron chink reminds me of my time in the canneries. Phillip worked as a coolie. I worked as an egg puller. I used to work right next to this fish cleaning machine. I stood in front of a conveyor belt with a head counting machine to my left and the fish cleaning machine to my right. I had to be really quick on my eyes and my hands as the fish passes me by at 70 per minute. These two machines were incredibly noisy. There was also the sound of the salmon cans, empty cans, sliding down the chutes. It may constantly make a ding, ding, ding sound. It was a wet, blood splattered, and noisy environment.
Look at this sea of masts. At the turn of the 20th century, San Francisco was the center of the salmon canning industry, with the largest canning company, APA, and the largest salmon canning fleet, which was the world-renowned Star Fleet. Near San Francisco, dozens of cannery ships were moored at Auckland Harbor during the winter months. In early spring, those aging three-masted windjammers were dispatched to Alaska to kick off the annual salmon season.
Here's a photo taken at a pier in San Francisco in 1904, just a few days before the ship set sail to Alaska. It can be seen that the Chinese laborers were preparing supplies, including dry goods, rice, vegetables. There was also live chickens and pigs kept on the deck, which could be used to supplement their food on special occasions in the cannery.
A three-masted windjammer looks majestic with full sail on open sea. But in 1910, they were already outdated and replaced by steam ships. But the fish company saw residual value in them, and they bought a large quantity of windjammers at bargain prices. but they also need sellers. Where did the sellers come from, you may ask? Fish companies were very smart. Sellers were white fishermen employed by the fish companies. Most of them were white European immigrants. When they got on a big windjammer, they worked as sellers. When they got on the small fishing boats at the cannery, they worked as fishermen. The Chinese laborers had nothing to do on the ship, and they lived in the hold below the deck, and they were quite miserable. Details can be found in our book, The Price of Salmon.
Here we see the cannery ship docked at a cannery in Alaska. The cannery ship remains there until the end of the fishing season, when the workers put the canned salmon in the hold before sailing. The Chinese laborers in the hold of the ship were escorted back and forth like coolies, knowing that no one could break the contract. But basically, as a rule, once you got on the ship, there was no way out. And once you were in Alaska, there was no going back halfway through the season.
Here we see fishermen fishing in Alaska. The white fisherman in the upper left corner is fishing with a seine, which is a vertical netting system. In the upper right photo, fishermen deliver fish to the flat-bottom transport boat. At the lower right, fish is transferred from the ship to the interior of the cannery by means of a conveyor belt. The photo in the lower left corner, we see the Indians in Alaska. They are using small boats for fishing. They had a little bit better luck than the Native American Indians on the mainland. They were not rounded up or sent to reservations, but they lost their land, their sea, and exclusive fishing rights. The US government provided some protection in that regard. Fishing companies must provide them with fishing and cannery jobs.
This is a real photo of a group of Chinese laborers and a few white men. The white men looks like corporate executives or investors from big cities wearing suits and ties. On the other hand, most of the Chinese are wearing traditional Chinese clothes and wearing their hair in queues. It was only after Sun Yat-sen overthrew the Qing government in 1912 that many Chinese cut off their queues.
It was a segregated world. The food and accommodation of the Chinese laborers in the cannery were completely separate from that of the white workers. There were almost no contact between them. The poor quality of the Chinese workers' food was mainly due to the Chinese contractors' stringent budgeting to save money. Sometimes Chinese workers could grow some vegetable by themselves or collect some seafood from the seashores to improve their diet. The dormitories were generally humble, lacking hot water, electricity, heating, and sanitation. Many dormitories were built by the early Chinese laborers themselves, which were completely inadequate to withstand the cold wind in western Alaska.
This photo from 1899 shows the Chinese laborers on a ship returning to San Francisco after the season. They came out on the deck to bask in the sun. They might have worked in the cannery industry for 10 years, or they might have done it for decades. It did not matter, as they had resigned their full lives to fate. They came to Alaska for 4, 5, 6 months a year, and that's probably where they earned their money for the whole year. If they were the first batch of the Chinese laborers in 1870, by 1900, they would be in the early 50s. Most would not be able to retire. Remember, only a small portion of Chinese laborers would make enough money and return to mainland China.
About 1/3 of them were actually married and had wives and children in mainland China. After the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1888, they were not allowed to go home and then return back to America. They lived in Chinatown, mostly single, and generally did not speak English. They had little or no contact with the white majority. Any racial discrimination was only tolerated or met with passive resistance. Since there's no writing left behind, we do not know their emotions or states of mind. During the anti-Chinese era, San Francisco Chinatown evolved into an inward-looking and self-contained community.
On this chart, we can see the number of workers over the years, including the Chinese in red, Chinese in blue dots, Japanese in red, Filipinos in yellow, and Mexicans in green. You might wonder why there are so many workers from other countries. Because the American West was short on labor, and as the number of Chinese was diminishing, cannery owners began looking for alternatives. From the chart, you can see the Chinese dominated the labor market from 1870 to 1910, and there were two peaks with over 6,000 workers during the Chinese dominance. The first time in 1882, during the heydays in Columbia River, and the second time in 1901 during the heydays in Alaska. After 1910, the proportion of the Chinese workers plummeted from 50% as other groups began to enter the market, including the Japanese in the 1910s and the Filipinos in the 1930s, followed by Mexicans, blacks, whites, and many others. In the 1930s, Philippines was an American colony, and many young Filipinos came to Seattle to attend colleges, but many of them ended up in Alaska. They called themselves Alascaros. Filipinos faced all kinds of unfair treatment, and sometimes they had to bribe the Chinese contractors in order to just get a job. Eventually, Filipinos decided to organize, form a union, and get rid of all the contractors.
By 1938, a Filipino-dominated labor union was formed, and they won the right for collective bargaining on behalf of all workers with the canning companies. At the same time, APA moved their headquarters from San Francisco to Seattle. The Chinese labor contract system and the Chinese workforce collapsed almost immediately. The Chinese merchants also disappeared after a few years. In 1938, when the union was first established, only 367 Chinese went to Alaska, which effectively marked the end of the Chinese involvement in the salmon canning industry. Since then, this extraordinary chapter of the Chinese-American history has been mostly forgotten.
You might wonder what happened to the Japanese. They used to hold a good share of the labor market. After Pearl Harbor in November 1941, the United States entered World War II. In 1942, Japanese and Japanese Americans in American West were sent to internment camps. Why? Because they were considered a threat to US national security. Since then, the Japanese have been forced out of the salmon canning industry, and the Filipinos have taken full control of the unions. That's why in the 1970s, when we went to the union, we found that the union was full of Filipinos.
Remember Astoria? Astoria was a small cannery town in the late 19th century. In 2011, the city of Astoria commemorates the city's 200 year anniversary and built this Chinese garden in the downtown area. It's called Garden of Surging Wave. It's a reminder of the early contributions of the Chinese migrants to Australia and to the Pacific Northwest of America.
Okay, thank you. This concludes our lecture on the Chinese and salmon canning industry in the Chinese exclusion era. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim and Philip. So pleased to have you guys.
Thank you too.
Thank you.